The room fell silent as the sharp click of heels echoed through the conference hall. Every eye turned toward the front, where a woman stood, tall, poised, and radiating an unshakable authority that seemed almost otherworldly. Her name was Evelyn Carter, though no one dared to call her by it anymore. She had been at the Department of Defense for 32 years, longer than most people in the room had even been alive. Yet here she was, standing like a statue carved out of ice, waiting for the verdict she already knew would come. Across from her sat Gregory Monroe, her boss, a man who wore his power like a second skin. His tie was perfectly knotted, his suit impeccably tailored, but there was something cruel about the way he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled together as if he were God himself deciding her fate. The air crackled with tension, heavy enough to choke on. Behind Evelyn, rows of desks filled with co-workers stretched out, their faces masks of discomfort, curiosity, or outright glee. They weren't supposed to be here, this wasn't how these things were done. But Gregory had insisted. Transparency, he'd said. Accountability. Bullshit, Evelyn thought, though her expression betrayed nothing. You've served admirably, Gregory began, his voice smooth and deliberate, each word dripping with condescension. But times change, priorities shift, and unfortunately, he paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room like a storm cloud. We must part ways. A murmur rippled through the crowd, quickly silenced by Gregory's steely gaze. Evelyn didn't flinch. Not when he announced her termination in front of everyone. Not when he listed off vague reasons, budget cuts, restructuring, performance reviews, that everyone knew were lies. She simply stood there, hands clasped loosely in front of her, eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably in his seat. It wasn't anger burning behind those dark brown irises, it was something far more dangerous. Resolve. Evelyn had seen plenty of firings in her decades at the Pentagon. Most ended quietly, the dismissed employee slinking away with their tail between their legs. Some cried. Others begged. A few even screamed. But none of them had ever looked at their boss the way Evelyn did now, as though she could see straight through him, past the polished veneer of professionalism into the hollow shell beneath. And maybe that's why Gregory felt compelled to keep talking, rambling on about severance packages and exit interviews long after the point had been made. Maybe that's why he couldn't quite meet her gaze anymore. When he finally dismissed her with a curt nod, Evelyn turned on her heel and walked out without another word. Her steps were measured, unhurried, every movement precise. No one followed her. No one dared. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving only silence in her wake. 3 days later, Gregory Monroe received a phone call that sent chills down his spine. It came late in the afternoon, just as he was wrapping up yet another round of meetings. The caller ID displayed a number he didn't recognize, but something about it, the prefix, perhaps, or the sheer audacity of the timing, made him pick up anyway. Monroe, he answered brusquely, leaning back in his leather chair. There was a pause on the other end, brief but pregnant with meaning. Then a voice, deep and commanding, spoke. Mr. Monroe, this is General Hayes from the Pentagon. We need to discuss a matter of utmost urgency regarding one of your former employees. Gregory froze, the pen in his hand hovering mid-air above the notepad on his desk. For a moment, all he could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Former employee? He managed to croak, though his throat felt dry as sandpaper. Yes, the general replied, his tone clipped. Evelyn Carter. The name hit Gregory like a freight train. Of course it did. Who else could it possibly be? Still, he struggled to maintain his composure, forcing himself to sound calm and collected despite the panic bubbling beneath the surface. I'm sorry, General, I don't understand. Ms. Carter was let go earlier this week due to restructuring within our department. Surely whatever issue you're calling about can be addressed without involving her further. Another pause, longer this time. When the general spoke again, his voice carried an edge that left no room for argument. Mr. Monroe, let me make this abundantly clear, this isn't a request. This is a directive. Be prepared to provide full documentation and justification for Ms. Carter's dismissal within 24 hours. Failure to comply will result in immediate disciplinary action. Before Gregory could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the receiver in his hand, stunned. What the hell had just happened? How had Evelyn gone from being fired in disgrace to having the Pentagon breathing down his neck less than 72 hours later? None of it made sense. Nothing about this situation added up. And yet, as Gregory sat there trying to piece together the fragments of what little information he had, one thing became painfully clear: Evelyn Carter wasn't done with him. Not by a long shot. Back in her modest apartment on the outskirts of D.C., Evelyn sat cross-legged on the floor surrounded by stacks of files, papers, and photographs spread across the coffee table. She hadn't touched any of them since returning home 3 days ago, choosing instead to let the dust settle and give herself time to think. Now, however, it was time to act. She picked up a photograph taken nearly 2 decades earlier, its edges worn from years of handling. In it, she stood alongside several high-ranking officials, including General Hayes himself. Back then, they trusted her implicitly, relying on her expertise to navigate some of the most sensitive operations the government had ever undertaken. Over the years, she'd built a reputation as someone who got results, no matter the cost. That reputation had earned her respect, loyalty, and more than a few enemies along the way. But none of that mattered now. Not really. Because what Gregory Monroe, and everyone else, didn't realize was that Evelyn had spent the better part of her career cultivating connections far beyond the confines of their little office. Connections that reached into the highest echelons of power. Connections that owed her favors. Connections that wouldn't hesitate to step in when called upon. With a small, satisfied smile, Evelyn placed the photo back on the table and reached for her laptop. Opening a secure messaging app, she typed out a single line: Phase 1 complete. Proceeding as planned. Within seconds, a reply appeared: acknowledged. Standing by for further instructions. It was almost poetic, really. After 32 years of service, Evelyn had been cast aside like yesterday's trash, humiliated in front of her peers, stripped of everything she'd worked so hard to achieve. But rather than crumbling under the weight of betrayal, she had chosen to rise. To fight back. To remind them exactly why they should have never underestimated her in the first place. As she closed the laptop and leaned back against the couch, Evelyn allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. Revenge wasn't her primary motivation, not entirely anyway. This wasn't just about settling scores or proving a point. It was about justice. About exposing the rot that had festered unchecked for far too long. About ensuring that no one else would ever have to endure what she had. Little did Gregory Monroe know, he had awakened a force far greater than anything he could imagine. And soon, very soon, he would regret every single decision he'd made. Gregory Monroe stared at the blinking cursor on his computer screen, his mind racing faster than his fingers could type. The general's words echoed in his head like a gavel striking its final blow: failure to comply will result in immediate disciplinary action. Disciplinary action. From the Pentagon. Over Evelyn Carter. It was absurd, infuriating, and utterly baffling. How had this happened? How had she turned the tables so quickly? He glanced at the clock, 10:47 p.m. His office was eerily quiet now, save for the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Everyone else had gone home hours ago, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the mountain of paperwork he'd been ordered to produce. Documentation. Justification. Evidence. He needed all of it, neatly packaged and ready to present by tomorrow evening. But how could he explain what he himself didn't fully understand? Evelyn's dismissal hadn't been about performance or restructuring, not really. She was brilliant, meticulous, and fiercely loyal to her work. No, the truth was far uglier. Gregory had grown tired of her presence, her unyielding competence casting an uncomfortable shadow over his own leadership. She was too old school, too rigid, too permanent. A relic of a time when bureaucracy ruled supreme and innovation took a back seat. He wanted fresh faces, younger blood, people who would bend to his vision without question. And Evelyn? She'd never bent for anyone. But none of that mattered now. Whatever leverage she'd gained in those 3 days since her firing, whatever strings she'd pulled, it was enough to make the Pentagon come calling. Gregory clenched his jaw as he opened another file on his desktop, searching for anything that might help him justify his decision. Anything at all. Meanwhile, across town, Evelyn sat in her dimly lit living room, scrolling through decades worth of encrypted emails on her laptop. The glow of the screen illuminated her face, highlighting the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the steely determination in her eyes. She wasn't surprised by the Pentagon's intervention. It was exactly what she'd expected. What she'd planned for. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table beside her, snapping her attention away from the screen. Picking it up, she saw a text message from an unknown number: meeting set for 0800 tomorrow. Be there. She smiled faintly, her lips curving into a smirk that carried both satisfaction and warning. This was just the beginning. The next morning, Gregory arrived at the Pentagon with a folder stuffed full of hastily assembled documents. He felt like a man walking to his execution, every step heavier than the last. As he approached the imposing building, its concrete walls looming against the gray sky, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every glance from passers-by seemed laced with judgment, every nod of acknowledgement dripping with suspicion. Inside, he was escorted to a conference room where General Hayes awaited him, flanked by two stern-looking officers whose uniforms gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lighting. The air was thick with tension, and Gregory's palms grew clammy as he placed the folder on the table between them. "Good morning, Mr. Monroe," General Hayes said coolly, his voice devoid of warmth. "I trust you've brought everything we requested?" Gregory nodded stiffly, sliding the folder toward the general. "Yes, sir. You'll find detailed documentation regarding Ms. Carter's employment history, performance evaluations, and the rationale behind her termination." Hayes opened the folder and began flipping through the pages, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he looked up, his piercing gaze locking onto Gregory's. "Mr. Monroe, do you have any idea why we're here?" "I assume it's to review my handling of personnel matters within my department," Gregory replied cautiously, though his voice wavered slightly. Hayes leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Let me clarify something for you. This isn't about your management style or your department's restructuring efforts. This is about national security. Specifically, the integrity of certain classified operations that Ms. Carter oversaw during her tenure." Gregory blinked, confusion washing over him. "Classified operations? Sir, I wasn't aware." "That's precisely the problem," Hayes interrupted sharply. "You weren't aware. And yet, you dismissed someone with access to some of the most sensitive information this country possesses. Without consulting us. Without considering the potential consequences." Gregory's stomach churned. He had no idea Evelyn had been involved in classified operations. Her job description had always been vague: administrative oversight, policy implementation, but nothing that hinted at top-secret clearance. Why hadn't anyone told him? Why hadn't she mentioned it? Before he could respond, one of the officers handed Hayes a tablet. The general tapped the screen a few times before turning it around to face Gregory. On it was a series of photos and documents, each more alarming than the last. Satellite images, intercepted communications, dossiers on foreign operatives, all bearing Evelyn's name in the metadata. "This is just a fraction of what Ms. Carter has contributed to our efforts over the years," Hayes said grimly. "And you fired her. In front of everyone. Do you realize the risk you've created? The exposure." Gregory stammered, struggling to form coherent sentences. I didn't know. I swear if I'd known." "You didn't ask," Hayes snapped. "That's the issue. Instead of seeking guidance, you acted impulsively, arrogantly. And now, thanks to your recklessness, we're left to clean up the mess." As Gregory sat there, reeling from the revelation, Hayes continued. "Effective immediately, you are suspended pending further investigation. Your security clearance is revoked, and you will cooperate fully with our internal review team. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," Gregory whispered, his voice barely audible. Hayes stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "We'll be in touch." Back at her apartment, Evelyn received a text confirming Gregory's suspension. She allowed herself a small triumphant smile before setting her phone aside. This victory was satisfying, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Later that afternoon, she met with a group of former colleagues in a secluded cafe downtown. They were all veterans of the intelligence community, individuals who owed their careers, and in some cases their lives, to Evelyn's discretion and expertise. Together, they formed a network of allies that extended far beyond the reach of any single agency. "We need to move quickly," Evelyn said, leaning forward in her chair. "Gregory's suspension buys us time, but it won't last forever. If we want to ensure accountability, we need to expose the real reason he targeted me." One of the men, a retired CIA operative named Marcus, nodded thoughtfully. "You think it's connected to the Phoenix Initiative?" Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "It has to be. That operation was shut down years ago, but not before Gregory got his hands dirty. If we can dig up proof of his involvement, we'll have leverage. Marcus frowned. That's risky. The Phoenix Initiative was buried deep for a reason. Stirring up old ghosts could attract unwanted attention. It's a calculated risk, Evelyn replied firmly. And one we have to take. For justice. For transparency. For everyone he's betrayed along the way. The group exchanged glances, silently acknowledging the gravity of the task ahead. Then Marcus spoke again, his tone resolute. All right. Let's get to work. As they dispersed, Evelyn remained seated, staring out the window at the bustling city streets below. The pieces were falling into place, but the game was far from over. Gregory Monroe had underestimated her once. He wouldn't make that mistake again. The next few weeks unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony, each note played with precision and purpose. Evelyn's network of allies worked tirelessly, piecing together fragments of evidence that painted an undeniable picture of Gregory Monroe's corruption. The Phoenix Initiative, a covert operation buried under layers of secrecy, had been designed to funnel classified intelligence to private contractors in exchange for kickbacks. And Gregory, it turned out, had been one of its key architects. Evelyn herself took the lead on connecting the dots, her decades of experience making her uniquely suited to navigate the labyrinth of redacted documents, encrypted communications, and shadowy connections. Late nights blurred into early mornings as she pored over files, cross-referencing names, dates, and transactions. Her apartment became a makeshift command center, walls covered in sticky notes and strings linking suspects to crimes. It was exhausting work, but Evelyn felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. About exposing the rot that had festered unchecked for far too long. Meanwhile, Gregory's world unraveled around him. Suspended from his position and stripped of his security clearance, he found himself isolated and desperate. Friends stopped returning his calls, colleagues avoided him in hallways. Even his family grew distant, sensing the weight of scandal hanging over him. He tried to fight back, hiring lawyers and issuing statements, but every attempt only seemed to dig him deeper into the hole Evelyn had created. Then came the day when everything changed. It was a crisp autumn morning when Evelyn received the call she'd been waiting for. Marcus's voice crackled through the phone, urgent and triumphant. We've got it. The smoking gun. Evelyn's heart raced as she listened to the details. Buried deep within a server long thought inaccessible was a series of emails between Gregory and a now-defunct contracting firm. The messages outlined payments made in exchange for classified information tied directly to the Phoenix Initiative. They were explicit, damning, and impossible to refute. Send me everything, Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. And alert General Hayes. It's time to end this. Within hours, the evidence was delivered to the Pentagon. General Hayes reviewed the materials personally, his expression darkening with each passing minute. By the end of the day, Gregory Monroe was formally charged with treason, corruption, and abuse of power. News outlets picked up the story almost immediately, splashing headlines across every major platform, senior government official implicated in massive espionage scandal. Gregory's downfall was swift and merciless. His mugshot appeared on television screens nationwide, his once polished image reduced to that of a disgraced criminal. As investigations expanded, more skeletons tumbled out of his closet, bribery, embezzlement, even attempts to sabotage whistleblowers who dared to speak out against him. The man who had once wielded such immense power was now utterly powerless, facing life imprisonment without parole. For Evelyn, the victory was bittersweet. She stood outside the courthouse on the day of Gregory's sentencing, watching as reporters shouted questions at the handcuffed figure being led away. Cameras flashed, capturing his defeated posture and hollow eyes. Part of her wanted to feel satisfaction, to revel in the knowledge that justice had finally been served. But instead, she felt something quieter, more profound, peace. She turned and walked away from the chaos, disappearing into the crowd. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from Marcus reading simply, "Well done." She smiled faintly, slipping the device back into place. That evening, Evelyn returned to her apartment, where the remnants of her investigation still cluttered the walls. For the first time in months, she began dismantling the makeshift command center, peeling off sticky notes and untangling strings. Each piece of evidence went into a box labeled, "Classified, destroy after use." When she finished, The room looked almost normal again, save for the faint outlines left behind by tape on the walls. As she sat down on the couch, exhaustion washing over her, Evelyn allowed herself a moment of reflection. 32 years of service, loyalty, and sacrifice had culminated in this moment. She had been humiliated, betrayed, and cast aside, but she had risen above it all. Not for glory or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from General Hayes. "You've restored honor to this institution. Thank you." Evelyn stared at the screen for a long moment before setting the phone aside. Honor. It was a word she had lived by her entire career, even when others forgot its meaning. And though her journey had come to an end, she knew her legacy would endure, not in headlines or accolades, but in the lives she had touched and the truths she had uncovered. As twilight settled over Washington, D.C., Evelyn poured herself a glass of wine and stepped onto her balcony. The city stretched out before her, a tapestry of lights and shadows. Somewhere in the distance, a clock tower chimed midnight. She raised her glass silently, toasting not to vengeance, but to resilience, integrity, and the unyielding belief that justice, no matter how delayed, always finds its way. And with that, Evelyn Carter disappeared into the night, leaving behind a world forever changed by her courage.